So, are you a perfectionist? Be honest. If we asked a room full of people this question, someone would almost certainly shoot their hand up, maybe laugh a little, and admit they're just a bit of a neat freak. We kind of wear the perfectionism label like a badge of honor, right? Especially at work. We tie it to high achievement, perfectly color-coded calendars, and flawless desks. But what if I told you that in the clinical psychology world, perfectionism isn't seen as some quirky productivity hack? It's actually viewed as a highly complex and potentially incredibly destructive psychological trait. Listen to this for a second. If I fail partly, it's as bad as being a complete failure. Wow, that is a completely harsh, uncompromising way to view the world. And it's not just a random quote we found online. This is a literal test item from an actual psychological assessment used to measure perfectionism. It perfectly captures the real emotional stakes here. We aren't just talking about a preference for a tidy room. We're talking about a rigid cognitive trap where anything less than absolute flawlessness feels like a total, catastrophic failure. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely demystifying perfectionism. Drawing straight from landmark psychological research, our core thesis for you today is this: perfectionism is a complex, multi-dimensional construct. It's like a giant puzzle made up of personal standards, societal pressures, and intrusive thoughts. We're going to explore the 5 faces of flawlessness, which are the 5 major scientific scales that psychologists actually use to measure and decode this fascinating trait. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the myth of perfectionism. Second, personal versus social perfectionism. Third, the discrepancy trap. Fourth, thoughts and self-presentation. And finally, why measurement matters. All right, let's dive right into section 1, the myth of perfectionism. We are moving way beyond the neat freak stereotype. To truly get a handle on this, we have to look at the clinical definition established by researcher Randy Frost and his team way back in 1990. They define perfectionism as high standards of performance which are accompanied by tendencies for overly critical evaluations of one's behavior. You see, setting high standards isn't inherently a bad thing. The true danger, the really toxic element, lies entirely in those overly critical evaluations. It's that punishing inner voice that absolutely attacks you the second you fall short of an impossible goal. And the stakes of living with that punishing inner voice, they are absolutely massive. Decades of psychology research link trait perfectionism to some really severe outcomes. We're talking clinical depression, debilitating anxiety, and extreme occupational burnout. It's also a huge driving factor in eating disorders like anorexia nervosa. But honestly, the most shocking data point from the source material is the link to early mortality. Perfectionism can literally shorten your lifespan. So this isn't just about how you organize your inbox, it is absolutely crucial to your fundamental physical and mental survival. To understand how this actually operates in the brain, researchers often use the diathesis stress model. Think of perfectionism as a diathesis, basically an underlying vulnerability. Imagine a hidden fault line in the concrete foundation of a building. On a sunny, beautiful day, the building looks perfectly fine. A perfectionist might look highly functional, even incredibly successful to the outside world. But when an earthquake of severe life stress hits, say a job loss, a breakup, a big public failure, that hidden fault line cracks and the whole structure collapses into anxiety. The harm is dormant until stress activates it. Which brings us to section 2, personal versus social perfectionism. Where exactly is all this pressure coming from? Is the pressure coming from inside the house or from the world around us? To figure that out, psychologists created the Frost Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale, or FMPS. It breaks the trait down into specific dimensions, measuring if your pressure comes from, say, parental criticism or your own personal standards. But the absolute most crucial factor they found is concern over mistakes. That's the central trigger. For someone scoring high here, a minor daily error, like a tiny typo in an email, doesn't just feel like a simple oops. It triggers a profound, agonizing sense of personal failure. Shortly after that, researchers Hewitt and Flett built their own scale, the HFMPS, which brilliantly contrasts internal drive with external pressure. They found self-oriented perfectionism, which is an intense, compulsive inner drive to be perfect. Then there's other-oriented, where you constantly demand flawlessness from everyone around you. But the most dangerous one? Socially prescribed perfectionism. This is the deeply rooted, terrifying belief that society, your boss, or your family demands perfection from you and will judge you harshly if you slip up. It is directly linked to feeling helpless and deeply neurotic because you're totally trapped by expectations you can't control. And to put into perspective just how real this clinical danger is, look at this number.
93.4. In clinical studies, this was the extraordinarily high average self-oriented perfectionism score found among women suffering from anorexia nervosa. That is one of the highest group averages ever recorded for this trait. It proves without a doubt that when this hyper-conscientious drive turns inward, the real-world clinical results are completely devastating. Moving right along to Section 3, the discrepancy trap, exploring the almost perfect scale revised. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't striving for excellence a really good thing? Well, the creators of this next scale totally agreed. They divided perfectionism into two distinct camps, adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive perfectionism is just having high standards, striving for excellence, enjoying order. That is super healthy. But maladaptive perfectionism introduces the toxic element, which they call discrepancy. Discrepancy is the perceived gap between your incredibly high standards and your actual performance. So it's not the high standards that hurt you. It's the haunting, inescapable feeling that you never ever measure up to them. To really wrap your head around this discrepancy trap, listen to this actual prompt from the test. I often feel disappointment after completing a task because I know I could have done better. Think about that for a second. When you reach a goal, does it bring you a genuine sense of pride? Or do you immediately spot a tiny flaw and think, I should have done more? If it's the second one, yeah, you are caught right in the middle of the discrepancy trap. Section 4, Thoughts and Self-Presentation. Let's look through the PCI and PSPS lenses. So far, we've talked about perfectionism as an enduring personality trait, being the kind of person who color codes their sock drawer. But researchers also created the Perfectionism Cognitions Inventory, the PCI, to measure it as a state. The PCI doesn't ask who you fundamentally are. It asks what you've been thinking about over the past week. It tracks the frequency of those annoying automatic thoughts like, why can't I just be perfect? The data shows that the more these automatic thoughts are buzzing around in your head, the higher your chances of experiencing severe distress and obsessive-compulsive symptoms. But what happens when the perfectionist actually leaves the house and goes out into the world? The famous sociologist Irving Goffman coined the phrase, the highly idealized self-presentation. He said we all basically act out a character for the world. And let's be real, for the perfectionist, keeping that flawless character in character 24/7 is exhausting. This dynamic led to the creation of our final scale. The perfectionistic self-presentation scale reveals the three distinct defensive masks perfectionists wear. First, perfectionistic self-promotion. You aggressively need to appear flawless. Second, non-display of imperfection. The terrifying need to avoid looking flawed, like you won't even try a new hobby because you might look bad doing it. And third, non-disclosure of imperfection, completely hiding your struggles from everyone. You can absolutely see why these masks are damaging, right? They are a fast track to intense imposter syndrome and crushing social anxiety, because no one is ever allowed to see the real messy you. And finally, Section 5, Why Measurement Matters. Let's summarize this whole psychological toolkit. Okay, we have thrown a ton of academic alphabet soup at you today, so let's tie it all together. The FMPS shows us how critical evaluation poisons our standards. The HFMPS reveals whether that pressure is internal or forced on us by society. The APSR highlights the tragic discrepancy when our absolute best just never feels like enough. The PCI exposes that exhausting, endless loop of automatic thoughts, and the PSPS uncovers the heavy, isolating social masks we wear. By using these 5 unique lenses, psychologists can take a giant puzzle like perfectionism and actually break it down to help people heal. So as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Look inward for a second and ask yourself, are your standards genuinely helping you grow, pushing you toward real excellence and fulfillment? Or have they become a trap, a constant, exhausting source of critical evaluation and an endless need to wear a flawless mask? Understanding the difference isn't just a fun exercise in productivity. The science proves it is absolutely vital for protecting your fundamental well-being. Thanks so much for diving into this fascinating research with me.